So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are when you watch this, and welcome to the reInvent Roundtable on lifelong learning and the future of work. My name is April Rinne. I am going to be facilitating today's conversation with a wonderful group of people from whom you'll hear in just a moment. And I'm just going to tee us up briefly as to why we're here today. Then we're going to do a quick round of intros and then dive into three different themes related to lifelong learning and the future of work, each of which is focused on skills, but from a different perspective. So very big picture, when we look at the shifts that are disrupting workers around the world, there are many, but we're going to be looking from the lens of two of the major ones. One being this shift from lifetime full-time employment to the rise of freelancers and independent workers and the self-employed, which in itself raises a whole new host of questions and issues related to the kinds of skills that are needed, whether educational institutions are fully equipped to provide those today, and how workers, independent workers primarily, are going to be sourcing the skills necessary to learn, run businesses, and thrive moving forward. Secondly, of course, is the more macro shift around automation, artificial intelligence, and new technologies that are displacing jobs, potentially to an unprecedented degree, and the fact that the need for adaptation and the need to reskill and upskill will be increasingly important to workers everywhere, whether they're independent workers, whether they're employees, wherever they happen to be in the world. So those are kind of the two big shifts. And against that backdrop, we really want to explore what skills are going to be needed to thrive and succeed in the future. And how do you prepare for finding those skills, getting those skills, maintaining those skills, and updating those skills as necessary. So we're going to be focusing on this from the perspective of hard skills, sort of technical skills and professional skills, as well as soft skills and the supporting skills needed to run independent businesses and small businesses. So we're looking at this from a really broad lens, but we'll be zooming in as the conversation goes on. There are just two quick caveats that I want to point out because, as all of us were discussing earlier, there's a very real risk of trying to boil the ocean in 90 minutes, and we don't want to do that. We won't be able to do that, but we do want to kind of craft and curate a more focused conversation that has insights that go beyond what we'll be talking about today, but really focusing on primarily, when we look at the world of workers, the younger cohorts. I'm saying those that have not yet entered the workforce, those that are early into their professional years and have decades left of really thinking about this upskilling, reskilling, how to procure the skills, and so forth. So we can talk about older workers and retirees, for example, and rethinking retirement. That certainly can enter into our conversation, but let's keep the focus to the extent possible on younger cohorts, younger workers, and those that will be most likely affected over the course of their lifetimes by these shifts. And secondly, I work globally and I always have a global lens. We can look at this from a global perspective, but to the extent possible, we'll be focusing on this from a US perspective to start, and comparing that with global examples where relevant. So I don't want to take up too much time here at the outset. I want to dive straight in. Again, thank you all for joining, both the panelists as well as anyone watching. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Nico to get us started with a quick round of intros. And what we're going to do is mention just who we are, our organization, and what brings us to this table. And then from there, we'll dive into conversation. Nico?
Thank you, April. My name is Nicolette Van Exel. I represent Intuit, and my role there is to lead our corporate responsibility efforts. What brings me to the table is recently our company has declared youth, particularly in the age range of 16 to 24, and enabling their economic opportunities as a core focus for our company. And as a company that serves millions of self-employed and small businesses and self-employed workers, we feel there's a great opportunity to bring our ecosystem closer together to better match the demands and also the skills available in the market, especially young people entering their careers.
Excellent. Thank you, Nico. George.
Hi, so I'm George Anders. I'm a editor-at-large at LinkedIn, based here in San Francisco. I'm also the author of a new book called You Can Do Anything, The Surprising Power of a Useless Liberal Arts Degree. So there are two things that brought me here, and they play to the two halves of my professional identity. The first is coming out of the book, I think there are enormous opportunities to build soft skills, to recognize soft skills, and to understand the importance of things like creativity, curiosity, teamwork, and that these can really be drivers of job growth as much as anything technical. So we'll have other people talking about the virtues of a technical education. I'm going to be Johnny One Note of yes, but if we can have people develop soft skills, that helps too. And the second thing coming out of my LinkedIn identity, there are an awful lot of job shortages in areas that could be solved with a plane ticket and a visit from the moving van. And I'd love to encourage geographic mobility, because I think right now we've got pockets of underutilized people, and we've got pockets of very high labor demand and shortages. And the trained economist in me says we should be able to get those forces to come together.
Fabulous. Thank you, George, and welcome. That's great. Sarah.
Thank you so much, April. My name is Sarah Slayton, and I direct the Youth Economic Opportunities Network at Making Sense International. We are a global hub dedicated to facilitating knowledge exchange, advancing practice and collaboration among stakeholders who are dedicated to advancing social and economic inclusion for young people. So typically between the ages of 14 and 25. And in this role in the last 2 years at Making Sense, I've been focused on leading the development and implementation of a year-round learning agenda to guide our network, focused specifically on the future of work, youth economic opportunities in a changing world. And we've done this through our annual Global Youth Economic Opportunities Summit, as well as our other network activities, with the goal to explore what the changing world of work specifically means for youth in developing contexts. And so not surprisingly, a few of the topics we've really focused on this year are what are the skills needed for a changing world of work, as well as this question of livelihoods through self-employment. And some of the questions that have come up for us and that I think would be interesting to explore today are things like, is the gig economy really something new? Is it offering youth an exciting opportunity and flexible livelihood, or is it simply a new name for the informal economy with all of the risks that come with that? What are some examples of innovative and accessible tools that can support sustainable livelihoods through gig work? And then, of course, what we're looking at today, which is what are the skills required of young people to successfully navigate that gig economy? And the second piece I would say is that I've spent the last nearly 13 years in youth development on education programs, peace building, and workforce. And I think the sort of combined experience of working across different stakeholders has made me really interested in exploring these questions from a systems-based perspective. So how are our development challenges linked and mutually reinforcing? And how can we also more effectively connect different stakeholders from youth, teachers, training providers, employers around this common problem? The last thing I'll say is I know that we're focused quite a bit on the US perspective today, and I work in the international space, so I'll do my best to make those connections and bring that into the conversation. So thanks again for having me.
Absolutely, and there is definitely a space for your role voice, and we'll be pulling on you for the international comparisons, because I think there's actually a lot to tease out, and obviously what we can learn about the US we want to make globally relevant and vice versa. So it's a two-way street. Wonderful. Welcome again. Tom.
Hello, my name is Tom Ogletree. I'm the Director of Social Impact and External Affairs at General Assembly. We're a global education company that's focused on helping to close the skills gap by developing employer-driven, practitioner-taught training in digital skills like web development, user experience design, digital marketing, data science. Most people who come to General Assembly are either students who are looking to change careers and enter the digital space, or businesses who are working with us to sort of transform their own workforces through upskilling and reskilling initiatives. I come into this to help think through how do we make sure that these programs not only work for those college-educated career changers, but also really help reach underserved and overlooked populations by giving them access to these types of trainings and then getting them into the digital economy. And we've worked with a network of nonprofit organizations, of private sector partners, government agencies to sort of think through how we can make this sort of accelerated technology training highly relevant for people who, may not have the sort of typical levels of access and economic opportunity that folks who have pursued college degrees may have had. Thank you so much for including me.
Fabulous. Can't wait to learn more. Thank you. And Tina.
Hi, so my name is Tina Hay. I'm the founder of Napkin Finance. We simplify complex topics and make money less intimidating and make concepts that are traditionally very difficult to understand more simplified for people in different stages of their life, whether they're making decisions for their careers or for their families or going through major life milestones like getting married or having a child. What we do is we actually work with a lot of college students. We worked with the White House last year, and we see a lot of trends and what people are interested in and what's really top of mind for people who are going into the workforce or who are young professionals. And some of the trends that we're seeing is, a lot of people are not only, in the gig economy, but really becoming digital nomads where their life and their careers are always on the move, and they may be based or working in the US, but also living internationally part of the time, or vice versa. So we're seeing a lot of, technology, how that's kind of taking over, reimagining the way that people are working and the structure of work. And also how technology has changed the way people see their careers progressing. It's become much easier to start a business. And for example, we cover a lot of different topics. Starting a startup is our most popular topic. So there's a lot of interest in people being their own bosses and being entrepreneurial. And then we see also a lot of interesting things happening around going to college or whether that decision is worth it. And we see crippling student debt. And so a lot of people are really wondering whether they should bypass that and, head straight into their career or whatever inspires them or they're most passionate about. So excited to be here.
Fabulous. I'd really like to actually speak with each of you more one-on-one. So this is a wonderful start. And Tina, even what you're saying now to not only some of the supporting skills, so to speak, how to start a startup, how to be self-employed, but then some of those ripple effects that come as you mature in your career, be it as an employee or as a self-employed, that start to evolve as a result of that decision. Fascinating. So super. All right. Intro's done. Let's dive into conversation. And like I said, I'm going to use the overarching theme of the different kinds of skills that will be needed to be a lifelong learner, to be a successful worker in whatever way, shape, or form that means for an individual moving forward. And I'd like to start with, I think, probably what is the more traditional definition of skills, which is what's your expertise? What are the technical skills that you bring to a role, to a project, to a task, to whatever it may be? This relates to everything from the fact that typically, we've studied, we've gone, not everyone, but a typical path would be study hard, get good grades, perhaps go to college, get a good job, sign up for lifetime employment, and that all of those nodes, so to speak, are now being questioned. And as we look at the future and the digital economy and the future of work as a whole, we know that digital skills will be much more important. Investment in STEM will continue to be really important. But to George's point, let's not forget the humanities. That actually will continue to be a thriving space to add value. And for those who are more, I suppose, entrepreneurial, also to be able to earn income, build skills, build careers and organizations as well. So I'd like to just dive in at a fairly basic level and think about, from a technical perspective, the kind of hard skills, professional skills, what we would think about. I'm not a huge fan of the term expert, but when we think about what makes you an expert in a given field today, that sort of thing. what is going to be needed 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, dare I say even 20 years out? That's probably unfair to all of us. But what are the kinds of skills that we need to be teaching towards, and how can workers, young workers, find those skills, identify and access those skills, whether or not that's within formal educational institutions, vocational programs and training, or what I'm also really interested in, things that we collectively may need to build. They may not actually exist today. How do we start reimagining that future? And Tom, not to put you on the spot, but I'd love to start with you, because what General Assembly is doing in many ways is in the bullseye of these shifts. And I'd love to hear how that looks from where you sit.
Yeah, it's a lot, there are a lot of sort of issues to unpack in that. And I think, what's exciting for me is that in the introductions alone, just a lot of the things that we see in terms of, the soft skills and career readiness and being able to sort of manage one's own, place in the world, sort of tie into all of the sort of themes that we are sort of engaging with every day. So really the origin of General Assembly is that, we were part of this community of learners and doers and entrepreneurs in New York who wanted to get digital skills and really understand the fundamentals of digital marketing or coding or UX design. And there wasn't really a sort of a space where you could learn that from other practitioners, especially not in ways that were tightly aligned with the demands of the labor market. So what we've really built is a set of programs that, the vast majority of our students are typically college educated career changers in their late 20s, early 30s. They've been in a sort of a tech adjacent field, and they now sort of see how all these different jobs are increasingly becoming hybridized and sort of touching every aspect of not only tech, but also some of those more traditional fundamentals, and that being able to rapidly reskill as technology evolves, but also as jobs evolve, is increasingly important. And so, I think one thing, though, that we're really mindful of is that, what we look for is not necessarily, a deep technical aptitude, but more a passion and a persistence and a willingness to try new things and to build things. And for some people who have advanced degrees have those in spades, some do not. Some, folks who have never gone to college, have all those qualities, some do not. And I think, though, what we've seen is that programs like ours, you run the risk of sort of deepening that skills gap between the haves and have-not. So I think we're constantly wrestling with how do you sort of remain responsive to labor market demand and make sure that those hard skills are in place, while also setting people up for success in the digital economy, recognizing that many of those kind of core fundamentals, whether that's good writing, good communication, teamwork, empathy, grit, are all kind of qualities that are absolutely critical for success in the digital economy. And so I think it's something that we, are grappling with every day. And I'm excited to sort of hear from others in the group in terms of how they're thinking about this, because I think that hard skills piece is mission critical. That's what employers are sort of lining up to us to say, we have all this talent. They don't have the most aligned skills with what we need right now. How do we think about that problem? But sort of underneath all of that is a set of assumptions and fundamentals that need to be in place for people to even be successful in a short form accelerated training program like ours.
Interesting. And I want to come back to that more fundamental layer. And I think we will. That will probably be a through thread for this whole conversation. But I'm curious to know, from a hard skills perspective, what is most in demand? When you look at sort of skills that you think there's a gap between the demand for them and the ability to supply today or in the near future.
For us, the biggest area of growth is data science, machine learning, predictive analytics. That's the kind of the core of our growth right now, though also we're continuing to see high levels of demand for, web development, UX design, digital marketing skills, cybersecurity is another big one. I also want to be clear that, General Assembly focuses on a fairly narrow subset of skills in the marketplace. And when you look at other sectors, whether that's healthcare or hospitality or others that are growing as well, there are also opportunities to think about what are those skills gaps as well, and what are the sort of types of institutions, whether it's programs like GA or community colleges or other institutions that can kind of step up to the plate and start to think about how do we better sort of address the fact that there are these sort of sustained gaps over time, and we want to think about how we can fill those for folks, so that, as things like automation or sort of shifts in technology may put people, out of their jobs or make their skills less relevant, how do we make sure that they can, get a foothold in a meaningful way, so that they can, continue to support their families and be active participants in their communities.
Mm-hmm. And as I shared earlier, I want for anyone to jump in whenever you'd like. By all means, this is intended to be a conversation. Let me just ask one other question in this, if I may. Tina, as I look at you and sort of starting a startup, and in a way, from a related yet different perspective, the demand and the questions that you're seeing in terms of what kinds of startups are the people that you work with most interested in starting? What are the biggest questions they have, and what are the biggest gaps that you see, again, more from this hard skills perspective? So we're going to get to the supporting skills around financial literacy and that sort of thing in a little bit. But when it comes to the kinds of businesses that people are interested in and the questions that they have, do you have any, what are your thoughts to share here?
Sure. So there are always the, the more popular kind of trending and hotter, like Tom was mentioning, data is one of them. Kind of, there's a lot of demand for people who know or are working in AI, artificial intelligence, data. What we find is anything really related to technology that, most businesses now, even if they're not a technology business, they have a technology component. So an understanding of kind of, what's behind that and being able to contribute with skills that can complement an existing business or to help start one that has a technology perspective, I think is really key right now. What we're seeing is a lot of people are making decisions on kind of on what, specialties to pursue and where their interests lie, not only in actually figuring out where the jobs are, but also really figuring out what lifestyle benefits there will be for them. What a lot of people I think don't realize is working within a lot of these positions is a lot of companies are now hiring more freelance and more independent contractors, and with that comes more flexibility, but with it also comes fewer benefits, health insurance benefits, vacation time, less stability. So we're seeing people kind of struggle between having more opportunities in some ways, but again, less stability and kind of a long-term career kind of, perspective. So there are benefits going in for people and also challenges we see.
Mm-hmm. I have too many questions here, and it's interesting because I feel like there's a question I have for Nico and for George and for Sarah, but I'm also wondering, and I've heard more and more recently, people have been talking about this concept of what does renewable learning look like? What does universal lifelong learning look like? Partly from a policy perspective, partly from an educational organization perspective, thinking about this from almost sort of the meta perspective. But as we think about how we're teaching, because again, I get that there are many different kinds of hard skills, the digital end of things, the data, the tech, the STEM, that sort of thing. I don't want to talk about that in exclusivity, but I'm just curious, and maybe this probably for either George or for Nico, this concept of what does it look like from an institutional and policy perspective to put in place a system that would allow for a kind of refresher cycle, a feedback loop, an ability to have lifelong learning that comes about, again, to speak to a bit of what Sarah was saying, from a systems perspective. That feels very, very far from where we are today, but I'm trying to figure out what are those early steps we might take that start getting us to that point where it becomes more of a societal expectation that everyone would be doing this, but also opportunities for constant upskilling, reskilling, retooling would be more easily available than they are today. George, why don't we?
So the issues that you raise, I think we need to roll back all the way to K-12 education and look at the way we teach people in their preteen years and teen years. And right now we're doing the classic thing that education does, which is to train people how to be effective in 1903 by having them learn cursive writing and learning how to multiply fractions, and then train people how to be effective in 1953 with a lot of geometry. And then eventually somewhere around senior year of high school, we're saying, oh, actually, we're going to send you in a totally different world. And now we want you to start doing team projects. And now we want you to start to think about how to manipulate data. And we'll introduce you to CS. But we've run people through this very slow pace effort to build in the traditional atomized knowledge of economy that doesn't exist anymore. So if we want to go, how do we create renewable learning? I think we need to start, whether it's 9 or 12 or what have you, have far more teamwork, have far more effort to learn new fields and just get used to the feeling of learning new fields, that you become an expert in something, you run with that for a little while, and then you become an expert in something else. And instead we kind of, track people along the same directions year after year, as opposed to getting people used to this sense of flexibility and adaptability. I really like Tom's point about the value of just-in-time learning, and I want to add a couple examples that speak to that. So Bowdoin, which is a marvelous liberal arts college, has discovered that a lot of its graduates would make really good product managers. And this would be a great source for employment. The problem is they actually didn't learn any product management at school. So they signed them up for a BYU class online, either senior year or right after senior year. And in 3 to 6 months, they're fully up to speed on product management and they can go get these jobs. But it's a hack, it's a workaround. And why not figure out a way to build that in more systematically, and also to build in the sense that once you've done your time as a product manager and you're ready to do something else, or those particular opportunities dwindle, you'll need to come back and take a 3-month or 6-month intensive class in something else. And that's a normal progression for a career. But I think the first thing we need to do is reset expectations. And unfortunately, what we do between ages 6 and 15 tends to gear people toward a world that doesn't exist. And then it becomes very jarring and disconcerting to move into this world of much more career fluidity and much more just-in-time learning.
Fascinating. Quick follow-up on that, if I may. And I know that we're not here to talk about the entire future of education in these 90 minutes, but there is a natural bleeding into that space. If I may ask, George, given all that you've researched and all that you've thought about and people you've interviewed and that sort of thing, what is your sense as to the degree to which we need to overhaul current educational systems that were built for, an industrial era and factory line workers and that sort of thing, into being more generative, more renewable, that way of looking at both learning as well as what comes after that in terms of professions and career development. On a scale of 1 to 10, do we need to be thinking about education reform that's, just completely overhauling the entire system in this regard? Or is it more that we can do, not hacks, but tweaks around the edges and offering a few more, additional courses and ways of things that students can opt into and that kind of thing? Do you have a point of view on that?
So I think the one thing that every would-be education reformer learns is that if you try and tackle the entire center core of education, it's like sort of running into a rapidly spinning pole. You're going to be bounced off and the pole will continue to spin. So an effort to change it from the top, I think, is difficult. I would encourage as many localized efforts to, whether it's charter schools, whether it's innovative programs within traditional public schools, whether it's private schools, looking for ways, one school at a time, to bring new ideas. But I think education is fundamentally very local. So we're going to need to start these ideas in a lot of different places and let them gradually spread. But yes, on your 1 to 10 scale, my flip answer is 12. But I think my serious answer is 7 or 8, that we can gain so many more years if we can rebuild the school system in a way that gets people ready at age 15 or 16 for this world that's coming, as opposed to getting them partway through college before we even say, oh, by the way, it's a different world out there.
Super. I think we'll come back to that for sure. And Sarah, I know I keep thinking about you also in the global context. I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Sure. So I did want to come back to the question that we started with about, what are the professional technical skills required of young people in changing world of work, and maybe ground that further in the different types of skills we're talking about. Because we're also talking about lot of different types of stakeholders and different types of young people. So, General Assembly is fantastic. It's targeting, I would say advanced digital skills and young people who would seek General Assembly out to reskill and retrain. In the places where we're working and developing contexts, and particularly with youth who are out of school, out of work, in some cases the heads of households, either as parents or as caretakers, whose education has been disrupted, or in other cases, with refugee and displaced youth populations, we may be talking more about basic digital skills. So the effective use of technology necessary in most professions. So web research, online communication, the use of professional online platforms and digital financial services. We're also talking about soft skills. I know we're going to dive into that, and then digital entrepreneurship. But I just wanted to kind of pick up on Tom's point about the way that digital skills are being taught, and just ground that further. And that there's different types and different levels of digital skills that we're talking about, and it really does depend on the population that we're targeting. The second skills piece I did want to raise, and that I think is really critical, and I think is really mutually reinforcing and linked to both digital skills and soft skills, is this question of entrepreneurial skills. And I say this because, if we think about the global economy today, more than half of the global labor force and more than 90% of SMEs, so small and micro, medium, small enterprises, are in the informal economy. And adding to that, even the formal economy is increasingly informalized. So you look at gig workers and self-employment. And I think this is where the skills around entrepreneurship and what those skills are going to be increasingly critical and really, really important. And I think there's a lot to be learned potentially from a closer look at the informal economy, where many young people are, where many young people are going to end up as we fail to create formal jobs to catch them. And that there's a lot of really interesting findings there in terms of how young people are being creative and creating livelihoods in spite of enormous barriers in very entrepreneurial ways. So I just wanted to raise this point about entrepreneurial skills and thinking about how we can better understand them both in formal and informal economies, because I think that's going to be really critical to the skills discussion. And related to this policy question and how we sort of knit systems together, I think education reform is a critical piece of that, but we're also talking about government reform. We're talking about teacher retraining. We're talking about the other side of that, so the employer side, and linking universities and education providers more closely to employers, and getting that buy-in earlier on. And I can say more about the work we've done in demand-driven training. We can go there, but I just wanted to raise these 3 points here about entrepreneurial skills, digital skills, and this policy piece.
No, thank you so much. And I would love, I think we'll have time as the conversation goes on, to hear some of the examples of, from wherever they're taking place in the world, of whether it's effective policy interventions, whether it's effective rethinking partnerships with companies, partnerships with nonprofits, you name it, in this space. And I know that Sarah and I have both worked quite a bit in a lot of developing and emerging economies. And while it is true that that's not the focus of this conversation, some of the most interesting and frugal innovation, but I would say most effective innovation, has actually come from those places where resources might be thin, but creativity out of necessity is sort of off the charts. So Sarah, please continue to chime in here. I mean, I think actually when we're talking about the entrepreneurial mindset, that is something that I had thought about talking more about in soft skills. So just in a few minutes. So we'll circle back to that in shortly. And I know that Nico wanted to add something as well. So Nico, please, over to you.
Yeah, so part of this is just an emphasis of what was already said. I think as a company, Intuit has a really interesting and unique ecosystem. So we serve financial, individuals and small businesses and entrepreneurs who need to run their finances. So we provide accounting solutions. We also have our own in-house. So Intuit as an employer has a need for very specific digital skills as well as broader business skills to inside our own company. So we have, the challenges around talent and how to attract and maintain engineering talent in a way that doesn't just meet the demands of today, but also really looks at how do we create a more diverse and innovative pipeline of individuals for the future. A massive, massive challenge, not just for Intuit, but for the broader technology sector. And then if you look at our ecosystem of millions of small business and self-employed customers, that's where we look at how do we help them to start and manage their business, because 5 out of 10 businesses fail, and in some lower income demographics that's even more. And so we have efforts to look at funding and both providing the tools and the capabilities to be able to be a successful small business. So those are kind of the hard skills and the dynamics of what goes into running an ecosystem like that. But then looking at when we looked at developing our more strategic focus on helping the next, so the younger generation of decision makers, entrepreneurs, and people who have to keep their books and manage their households, we saw a very consistent thread and a very consistent need, and that might speak to your systematic point of what do we do at a systematic level, and that's both in schools, that's in our own companies, that's in our system, and the government, the way they look at education is, we need to raise people with an entrepreneurial mindset that helps them to deal with the future of work and the future of their jobs and the complexity of their lives in different ways. And when you think of an entrepreneurial mindset, that is not just teach me a digital, give me a digital program, because every single person is going to be touched by coding. So every young person just needs the fundamental skills of knowing how to code or what goes into technology, because everything around us is going to be virtual, and everything around us will have an element of technology in your lives, no matter what you do. And so that's kind of one of those table stakes. It's core, it's a given. But then when you think about how to learn and apply yourself in the workforce as this becomes less secure, the key things are around problem solving. How can you teach young people to critically solve problems and teach them that it's okay to fail, and failure actually breeds innovation and entrepreneurship, and that it's okay to not just learn checklists in a classroom, but that you actually have to set yourself into a different environment with diverse people in a collaborative environment where you just don't always have the answers and the teacher won't give you that answer. And so what I'm trying to say is that our mindset around learning and teaching, when we look with the future workforce in mind, is such a systematic and dramatic shift that we have to go through, that it's not just a policy question. It's not just a private sector question. I think this fundamentally goes back to where we have to find out what is it going to take to actually make the demand and the supply meet better. Like, what are the things that we need in the future, and how do we actually train people? And it's not a 4-year degree. It could be a workforce development program. It could be a 2-year, it could be in some of the developing countries. It could be teaching them through Samasource basic digital skills that they can apply to work for a large company in Silicon Valley to help them code their AI devices. There are ways that we need to start thinking about this that is different. So I think it starts with a fundamental shift in the mindset. And I think, just then taking it from super meta all the way down to super micro, some of the things that we're looking at as a company is going into classrooms and teaching the fundamentals of what it means, what finance means in your lives. Like, finance is not, it's not about accounting and doing tax. How do you make that much more personable in your life? Like, as a student, as a person sitting in a classroom, we go and teach D4D. Our Design for Delight is our design thinking expertise that our founder, Scott Cook, has rolled out to our whole company a few months ago. All of our employees were put through this exercise of, let's look at how do we solve for customer back, so customer first. So when you think about problem solving, don't just start thinking about inputs and what you need to do to learn in schools and standard like things. What are you actually solving for, and what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, so that helps you to think differently about what you're going to need to be able to achieve that goal. And so that goal could be, I want to set up an enterprise. That goal could be, I want to work for Goldman Sachs. That goal could be something else. But whatever you have in mind, I don't think there is a one size fits all for people to achieve their dreams in the future. And that is consistent, whether it's in the US, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Brazil. The dynamics and the socio-demographic dynamics are different. But I think the concept of it is the same, because that's what technology does. It makes everything universal. And so access becomes universal too. So you can become an Uber driver in Brazil if you're on a very low income, but you still have to manage your finances and you still have to figure out how to make things work. And so that, I think, is the fundamental shift in what we're looking at a super meta level. I just came back actually just yesterday from a program where we went into a school with NIFTY, so the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship, to actually go and see how we teach entrepreneurship and design thinking in a classroom to 16-year-olds who suddenly are opening their eyes to a different world in front of them. So I just wanted to give that perspective, because I think there's so much richness across all of the thoughts and the ideas, but I don't think it's one thing alone. I think it starts with how we think about and what we're trying to solve for.
This is great, Nico, and thank you for that. And also, I think it's actually a perfect segue, because in this wonderful way, we've started dipping on multiple occasions already into that soft skills, the entrepreneurial mindset, but also things like EQ. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the latest DQ. So we've got IQ and then EQ, emotional intelligence, but DQ, which is one's digital intelligence. So your ability to be digitally savvy, which means not just do you know how to use digital tools, but do you know how to put them down? Do you know how to scan for not just fake news, but any kind of fraud? Do you know when somebody is really your friend versus just, an acquaintance, that sort of thing, with a heavy focus on youth as well. So I think we're already dipping our toes, more than our toes at this point, into the softer skills and some of the mindset shifts and those anchors that underpin whether it's, whether you're going to go into arts or sciences or medicine or whatever your field might be in the future. I'd love to continue in this vein that many of us, I think, are already leaning into and talk a bit more. And actually, Nico, if I can ask, I'm just curious about the NIFTY, that immersion that you attended. So can you tell us more? What I'm curious, and this is an open question to everybody, but I'll ask you first, Nico, since you just mentioned it. Examples. So when we think about soft skills, I mean, for me, the number one that comes up is how to be an entrepreneur and how to be a self-starter and how to get comfortable with this concept of continual adaptation. And I think what's hard is not everybody wants to adapt all the time or to know that that's kind of potentially a new normal. That is a mindset shift that is really hard and not necessarily, I don't want to get into whether, issues of fairness or equity. It's something that everybody, wherever you are on the economic pyramid, is likely going to have to undergo to some degree. But it also means things like active learning. It means knowing how to make decisions in face of increased uncertainty and increased types of information that we don't know are necessarily true. I mean, it has all of these different layers. And what I'm really keen to hear from everybody are examples of tools, programs, initiatives, resources, you name it, that start building that sort of a breadcrumbs to a path forward that looks like might be hopeful, might have insights for other people and other organizations elsewhere. So Nico, to start with you, and then I open it up to everyone. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I think one of the things you just already mentioned, the reason we're approaching it this way, and we're looking at it's actionable learning, I guess is the term that you used. We see it more as we build customer empathy with the people that we're trying to help, and that's our whole design methodology as a company, and it's what we apply to our products with our customers. And we also see this as a great tool to deeply understand what young people are facing as they make these decisions in their future, for their future careers. And so it's kind of a deep immersion. And so one of those immersions is with Nifty. I think the key to it is there are certain frameworks and education frameworks or learning frameworks that are really great, but when you go to a lower income demographic, typically those don't apply. And so what we've learned very quickly is that by actually going and seeing and learning by doing, we're actually gaining really great qualitative insights into what especially what we shouldn't be doing. So with this specific program is in lower income demographics, understanding in public schools, trying to get the schools to adapt or adopt a program that is completely focused on entrepreneurship and innovation. So it becomes part of the curriculum of that school. And so it's not an after school program, it is something that they do during the day. So that's key. So it has to be something that a school is willing. For one teacher, they have a sponsor. So the teacher sponsors it, the school pays for it, and then Nifty gets funders like Intuit, PayPal, other companies who are involved to help support and to scale that across the US. And so they're making really good progress because they're starting with a very small problem in a very small kind of community and working their way, scaling it progressively, so to speak. And the way that curriculum looks is, and when we joined this, it was all specific entrepreneurial problems. I want to set up a recycling program in my neighborhood. I want to build an electronic bicycle and a green bike. And so they're put together to create business plans, to ideate, and they go through, without noticing it, they go through the process of innovation, step by step by step. And then by the end of their semester, they actually pitch their ideas and they can get their ideas funded. Now, the idea of competitions isn't new, but what I really like about this program is the fact that it is active learning that leads to an outcome where those students could see a potential for themselves to run a business, but it's not focused on them becoming entrepreneurs or small businesses. But those skills they can take with them wherever they go. When they go to college, if they start their own, if they're self-employed, or if they start their own small business. So that's, I think, the key to it is to make them an active participant in that learning process. So it's not a traditional way of teaching. It's very hands-on, but it's very effective.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, Tom.
I'd love to echo a lot of that. I'd love to get George's perspective on this as well, because I think this ties up into so many of the things that he talks about in his book. One of the things that I talk about sometimes is that, there are certain things that, I may not use in sort of my day-to-day career, whether it's the scientific method or some of the things that I learned in high school chemistry, but those, gave me a context for understanding the world, number one, and also some methodologies for thinking about problems, right? And I think that that's what so much of this is about how do you build that continuum and that ecosystem of resources and support so that no matter who you are, or where you live, or what your zip code is, that you can begin to tap into some of those resources. I think Nifty is a terrific example, but I also think that sometimes I think that there's, in some of the conversations I have with leaders, the question is, well, if we can just train everybody how to code, will that solve our problems? I don't think so. I think that we need to have a more sort of holistic ecosystem approach that says, in the same way that, we host the young entrepreneurs from Black Girls Code and Girls Who Code and Code.org on our campuses, week in, week out. We're working with, high schools and donating our curriculum so that they have some of these resources. We're thinking about how do you partner with community colleges and other institutions to sort of plug some of this capacity in there as well. But when we talk about lifelong learning, that doesn't start once you graduate college, right? It starts at a very young age. And I think I really appreciate what George was saying at the beginning, is that there are lots of potential interventions that can sort of create some of those touch points, whether it's the Nifties of the world or the IBM T-Techs of the world, that are sort of playing a really critical role in terms of shifting some of that narrative. But that it's going to take a lot of organizations and a lot of different sort of touch points to make sure that it's not just that sort of one-off weekend experience, but something that's embedded in the whole sort of way that young people engage with the world and get their education and think about problem solving and understand the economy and understand how to acquire skills.
Excellent. Couldn't agree more. I have a couple of follow-up questions for you, Tom, but I'll return to those in a minute. Well, for everybody, but around associations, networks, collaborations amongst organizations in terms of everything from how do we get this to scale, but also how do we really build on the best of a much broader range of organizations and insights. So thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate Tom's point about linking more to systems. And we saw this in youth development where there was a lot of excitement around coding camps and an ability to achieve scale quickly, but not so much in terms of sustainability and job placement for young people. So there's we think about this as a pathway. I think that that's a really important point, that you can build a fantastic technology platform, but if it can't be accessed or effectively used, and if it doesn't change the attitudes of employers or educators, then the impact will be much less than we would hope. In terms of soft skills and coming at this from a youth development perspective, we've seen 3 trends in our community around this. And the first is that we know what they are now and that they matter. And I'm not sure if we've listed those anywhere, but there's been a lot of really good research that's come out in the last few years on what soft skills are, and flexibility, dependability, higher order cognitive skills, interpersonal skills, and intrapersonal skills. So things like self-control, future orientation, grit. So I just wanted to bullet those out so that we have them in the back of our minds. The second thing that we know is that these are valued by employers in formal and informal economies alike. But the most exciting thing that we've seen is, and I think this touches on what Nico and Tom have referred to, is that we're seeing much more emphasis on the how. So how do we train? How do we teach these skills? Using blended approaches, that it's not enough to create training academies and crank out young people with soft skills. That's not really impactful. But there are a lot of really interesting ways that technology and other things like dance and the arts and music and film are being deployed to teach young people skills, things that are really hard to learn, I think, later in life, that ideally these are things that you gain early in development, in a safe environment with supportive systems and adults in your life. The reality is that we're working with young people who faced a lot of impact and trauma and disruption in their lives. And so how to teach these skills later on is really tricky, but we are seeing some really interesting examples. And just to offer a few from our global summit this last September, one of them is the use of technology to identify hidden talent or the potential of soft skills within young people that may not be immediately apparent from a CV. And in particular, because we don't teach and train for these skills traditionally, and we don't test for them either. How do you identify talent that may not be immediately obvious to recruiters, to employers? And so we worked with a company called Knack that uses gaming. It's a predictive gaming technology that helps match young people to fields of study and skills training. And so they use gaming to pull out evidence of creativity and problem solving, and some really interesting work there. And they're now working with training providers in India, including Tata Strive. And that's informing how they invest and how they train in youth employment programs and entrepreneurship programs. Another really cool example from our summit was a group called the Backlot Foundation. And this is a group that's using film to teach both digital skills and soft skills. This was a program funded through the IDB in Suriname called Powered. And it was really interesting. Youth created their own films. And part of the purpose of this was really to target young people who've dropped out of school or who are in need of a second chance, to help them tell their story and to create greater confidence through that process of storytelling. Another example is reaching young people in Afghanistan using a combination of in-person teaching and mobile phone platforms to impart soft skills training. And this is in response in part to a huge demand among young people themselves for these skills, because there's a recognition that they need these skills to navigate the changing world of work. So again, I think there's just an array of different programs that are deploying more and more creative, diverse ways of pulling together both technology and the arts and different approaches to teach these skills. And I think that's what's going to be really critical going forward.
Wonderful, Sarah. And it's interesting. I think while we might be focusing on workers and youth in the US for this call, there is absolutely no way that we can't be informed and inspired by examples from anywhere. And I continue to say, like, it's amazing to me what is happening outside of the US. And as some of you on the call know, I work primarily globally. And it's usually a delight to get on the plane and leave the US because what I find elsewhere is it's often so relevant to what's happening in the US, but it's the kinds of ways of looking at the world, particularly when you're quite far from Silicon Valley and you don't have that same the same preconception about what Silicon Valley is or isn't. And you're just using these technologies to meet needs and to do things that you couldn't do before, but then to be able to import some of those ideas and initiatives back. Thank you very much. And George, I know we've been referring to you quite a bit. What are your thoughts on this? Because you're probably more steeped on the soft skills than any of us in terms of your research and the number and diversity of people that you've spoken with about the role of soft skills and where to go from here.
So I want to zoom in on a couple of things that Sarah said, because I think there's great job creation potential there. A lot of creation has happened even without our good help. And if we treat this as an area to target, there's room for even more. And in particular, what was referred to as interpersonal skills. So I would turn it into what I'm going to talk about as reading the room. And when I did my book, I analyzed 5,000 jobs on Indeed.com that paid $100,000 or more and asked for critical thinking. And then I drilled down and said, okay, what are we really looking for here? And in an awful lot of cases, it's that ability to work with different factions, to get different groups of people in agreement, to align interests. That's very labor intensive. It doesn't mechanize it all well. We're now in a US economy where we've got 14 million people working in sales and 10 million in all of manufacturing. Sales is bigger than manufacturing, which is always kind of startling to realize at first. But what reinforces that even more is when we automate, we take out factory jobs. When we automate the sales process and put in CRM software, we actually still need more salespeople. We just make them more effective and there's more to do and we expand. So the opportunities there are big. And if you look at something as simple as car repair, we've de-skilled the mechanic's job. There's now a plug-in device that will tell you what's wrong with the car. And we tend to pay mechanics surprisingly little. It's down to about $20 an hour. We now pay more to the person with the clipboard who chats you up and finds out what your problem is and deals with your inarticulate, murky effort to express why your car is misbehaving and figures out what your rumble sounds might mean. That's a better job now. That pays $25 an hour. So the opportunity for growth there is tremendous. We need to figure out a way to develop people's natural ability to get along with each other, to read the room, to build coalitions, and to quantify that as a skill, to figure out how to get that onto the first page of the resume. Because right now it tends to come out in job interviews, but it comes out fitfully and haphazardly. We need a way to systematize that because that's what a lot of employers are looking for. And then the second area is being able to communicate persuasively and effectively. And we talk about communication skills as being useful, but we tend not to say what it is we want. And what we really want is that ability to engage a workforce. And if you look at Gallup surveys, we have an awful lot of disaffected people in the American workforce. I mean, the number of people who are fully engaged with their job bounces around 30, 35%. That means you've got 65% of the workforce that can't wait till Friday and does not look forward to Monday. And if you're going to be effective in driving change or growing a business or pivoting what you're doing, you need that ability to get through with people. When I use LinkedIn data to look at how people define what they get out of education, it's interesting that at the community college level, one of the top things people list is leadership. And that's sort of frontline leadership, store managers, people who can lead restaurants, the like. When you look at what people get out of some of the brand name liberal arts, four-year colleges, the top research universities, public speaking ends up at the top. And if you think, okay, there's some level of leadership you can do with a community college degree, but the people who tend to run the country tend to be the ones who went to the fancier schools. What do they see as their key to leadership? And it's that ability to speak persuasively, to get up in front of a group, to use the tools of mass media. And again, that's something that we don't know how to put on the front page of the resume yet. And yet, when you look at who gets hired, who gets promoted, that ability to inspire and excite a group of people is crucial. So I don't think our vocabulary is caught up. I think the economy is kind of moving in that direction without even very clear guidance. But I think the more we can do to recognize and showcase the two areas I just pointed at, being able to read the room, being able to communicate persuasively, those are people that can then snap on whatever technical skills they need through intense short-term training of the sort that General Assembly and all the other programs we've heard about offer. and go from one career to another career to another career and be incredibly valuable and create jobs for other people.
Fascinating. And I can't help but think, Tina, I'd love to turn to you as we think about things like reading the room, communicating persuasively as core skills in general, but also that can help build and run effective businesses. Does this kind of thinking, this kind of need, I'm curious whether or not it shows up in the kinds of things that you do with your customers and communities, and at the same time, whether or not it's a question that you get from those who are keen to work with you.
Back to what George was saying, and also Nico and a lot of the panelists, we find what's interesting is we find a lot of, and so this actually touches on soft skills, is there's a disconnect between people's expectations as they're entering the workforce of what work is like, you know, and their employers, who a lot of them are not like the Intuits of the world, who have these amazing dynamic organizations that can train and kind of communicate in ways that are really collaborative. A lot of companies are having difficulties kind of not only training, but attracting people who can really dedicate kind of the time and energy in like, you know, in building those skills that are necessary to work in any type of environment. And so what we're seeing is there are a lot of misunderstandings about kind of really what work is, how people define it is so different. You know, we see a lot of people wanting to get into careers that have meaning and where they're making a difference. But, you know, part of that is also, you know, working to learn the skills and working, you know, to learn how to kind of understand the dynamic between coworkers and leading other people and politics and all the other kinds of things that come along with any job. So part of what we do see is, and actually this goes back to Tom's point earlier, is that there are a lot of skills that are not really, you know, specifically addressed in your education that will be really important when you do get out of your career, you know, whether it's science or, you know, health or whatever it is. But they do, a lot of these things do actually impact the longer term career and how people are open to learning and working with others and solving problems and so on. But also a lot of what we're finding is a lot of really important skills that people should be learning in school are not taught. And that goes actually to Nico's point about finance. Like, you know, most people, regardless of your career, most people are not learning about money and finance in school. And if they don't learn from their parents, they never learn. And so that's actually one issue we found that's important and critical for everyone's life, is to actually have an understanding of basic financial skills, as important as any other topic. So I think what my kind of, you know, thoughts are from our conversations are, you know, again, this disconnect, what people's expectations are of, you know, wanting to, the millennial mindset of wanting meaningful work, but then also being able to go into a larger organization that doesn't necessarily have those, the same, you know, requirements and the same patience and time to kind of restructure their workforce to be able to kind of adapt to this new demographic and this new kind of perspective on what work should be and how meaningful it should be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and Tina, thank you for that, because kind of like we started bleeding into soft skills, and then I was like, let's transition. We're now, I think, bleeding particularly when it comes to things like finance, financial literacy, some of those core skills that aren't taught by a school, and they're not considered to be hard skills unless you're going to work in finance. But looking at some of those supporting skills, as I've often talked about and had conversations with others, like it would be wonderful if a mini, I don't want to say a mini MBA, but sort of the basic tools that you need to live your life, which, you know, yes, I recognize that Bitcoin might be coming and alternative community currencies might be coming and so forth, but the fact remains that money as we know it today will continue to drive some portion of the economy and our workforce. That these are skills that, to your point exactly, Tina, they don't drop from the sky and they're not guaranteed by education. So how do we start thinking about ways to deliver those more innovatively? And I think that what Napkin Finance is doing is great, and obviously Intuit is getting more into this space, and there are other organizations as well. But I'd love to think about and hear examples of programs where I think particularly from the perspective of financial literacy, that feels to me like part of the 101 of where we're heading, and to know how to run a budget, costs and expenses, very basic elements that if we imagine a world of work in which, it was going to be 2030, but now in the most recent report, by 2027, over half of the US workforce will be freelance or independent. That means half of the workforce without necessarily, there's no guarantee that they have that kind of training of how to run a budget, pay taxes, that sort of thing. I'd love to talk about examples of programs and initiatives that are working, as well as things that we may need to build. And here too, Sarah, I think about you and your work globally. Financial literacy is it is absolutely not unique to the US. It's something that is needed everywhere. And I spent many years earlier in my career focused on microfinance, for example, and understanding the importance of financial literacy before someone takes on a loan, whether that loan is $25 or $25,000. So shifting in this last phase, I guess, of this conversation to what some of the most critical financial supporting skills are, finance being one of them, but opening the floor to all of you in terms of programs that you've seen work well, as well as programs or tools that we would like to see exist. The floor is open.
Well, April, I can offer yet another program example from overseas. I apologize. But Making Sense is partnered with Heifer International in Uganda and Tanzania for what we call the East Africa Youth Inclusion Program. And it speaks to some of what you're getting at, which is that we are looking specifically at barriers for youth to engage in agricultural market activities. And this combines a focus on soft skills, enterprise skills, as well as financial literacy. And that's been a big part of Making Sense's work, is how to make finance more inclusive for young people. So it's not just teaching young people how to create a business plan and manage a budget and manage their finances to run a business. It's also about working with banks and lendees to create more youth-friendly products. So loans that have maybe no interest rate or a low interest rate, smaller loans. And really, I think it goes back to the larger theme that's run throughout this conversation of linking together services from young people, training providers, banks in this case, but also employers, educators, governments. That really this is about combining approaches to preparing young people. And I really don't think that self-employment programs or skills development programs, if we are pushing young people into being self-employed or into the world of entrepreneurship, really should be happening without a focus on financial inclusion and financial literacy, because it is such, as Nico says, such an integral part of being able to navigate this world and to be able to save and not just have kind of menial wage jobs, but actually build a sustainable livelihood that can advance a young person and kind of open up those possibilities. So that's one program example from our work overseas. But I mean, I think that there are very clear connections to opportunity youth and the challenges that young people are facing in the US. Whether they are university graduates going to General Assembly to change their career course, or they're opportunity youth in the US, so out of school, out of work, coming out of the foster care system, who are trying to get a start in the workforce and facing enormous barriers. That all of these skills, navigating the workforce, financial literacy, overcoming barriers to digital literacy, these are all universal challenges. They look different in different contexts, obviously, but I think that there's some very clear links between the two. So just to answer your question a little bit about the financial inclusion piece.
Thank you. Yeah, and Tom, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I know you have some thoughts. I also have a question, which is for General Assembly students, something like access to financial services or access to financial training. Is that part of your platform?
It is not, and it is something though that we think about a lot, because I think kind of like tied into some of the points that Sarah was making is it's not just about the the financial training, but it's also about the access to the kind of resources to be able to get the skills that you need, right? Our career transformation programs last 3 months. They're all day, every day. You can't work while you're doing them. So being able to have a stable living environment, access to nutrition, access to childcare and transportation, is absolutely critical, just to be able to take that time. And I think, the one of the things that we've really focused on is how do we sort of make, these kind of the skills, accelerated skills training, faster and more compact, so that there's less opportunity cost for participating in the programs. It still, knocks a lot of folks out who, number one, just don't have the resources to pay for the cost of training, but also don't have the resources to be able to focus on the training and then in the job search. So I also want to say that, one of the things that we think about a lot, in terms of our programs for students who may be coming out of foster care or transitioning out of prison environments or have faced barriers to education and employment, is how do you think about those wraparound services that are absolutely required for people to be successful while they're getting that skills training. I do think, though, that, I do want to sort of underscore Sarah's point that, all those factors in terms of, preparing people not just for the workforce, but sort of operating within the world are absolutely critical. And I think one of the things that we really try to do is, on sort of two tracks. One is to focus on, how do you translate your past experience, whether that was managing a Nike store or being an artist or working in, big law, into, your resume when you're starting out a new career as a web developer or a data scientist. So that kind of, that also ties back to mindset and being able to sort of translate your own skills and abilities into another context, and capitalize on those values of qualities of empathy and reading the room, as George was describing, that are so critical. But I also think that there's a lot of work that we need to do to sort of set people up for success in a rapidly changing economy that don't necessarily have to do with on-the-job skills, but more for how you take care of yourself as you operate in the world and sort of understand those issues related to financial literacy, but also to leadership that are, so core to every aspect of this conversation.
If I can quickly jump in, this is Nico. So when I think about financial literacy, it's just, there are so many levels and layers to this, but just a couple of examples, and I think that it shows up again in different ways. Financial literacy, I think, as a curriculum or something that you teach, typically, from what we've seen, works when you're in an environment like an Intuit, or you're in a university or in a school. You're in an environment where there is the ability to learn that and to insert that into the program. So, for example, Intuit launched a whole new education channel, an education program where we teach accounting now in community colleges and universities all across the United States, and we're expanding that globally, and that's great. But that really serves those who have made it to that 4-year degree and who've made it to that college and who are successful. So that's a great win, because it's a great way to scale it. It's a digital platform, so professors and teachers, everyone can learn and teach that skill of, hey, when you graduate, here are the things, here is how you can keep your books, and here are the things that are really important. Then when you think about opportunity youth, to what Sarah was talking about, and Tom, I think you were alluding to, is the environment within which young people operate there, or just people in general who are thinking about finances. There, it's day to day, it's paycheck to paycheck, not even. It's day to day of how do I get to my job, come back, and it's not about managing finances. So there, it's about meeting people where they are, and meeting people where they are is really critical and fundamental. There's another program I can highlight there, which is Juma Ventures, is based here in San Francisco, and they help young people who are out of a job and out of school to actually, they give them temporary jobs, like in consignment. They work at the stadiums here, and then they give them an incentive to save part of that paycheck, and they help them put that money into a bank account and then match that money and say, if you put, say $500 in total away of your paycheck, we'll match that money. And so those are ways, again, and I go back to this shifting mindsets and behaviors. If you see what the potential is, and if you see that there is, that you can actually do that, even if you're low income and you're not making a ton of money, And by the way, it's been proven that people in lower income demographics are a lot better at saving than people in higher end and higher income demographics. But if you just show that early enough and that momentum, people can see the potential. So showing people the potential and actually having them activate on that is incredibly powerful. And the challenge there, I think, is to do that at scale. But I think, again, it starts with small intentions and moments. And the more we're aware of this, the more we start doing that, then we shift the conversation from financial literacy to financial capabilities. And capabilities is a really different way of looking at this, where I think it's time to move away from just saying we're going to teach this and we're going to give this curriculum to how do we make people adapt and change their mindsets and behaviors around finance, because it's one of the hardest things to do, and just make that actionable.
Fabulous. Thank you, Nico. No, and this is great. There's so much I want to dive into more. George, I know you had a couple things you wanted to say as well.
Good. There we go. So I'm going to touch a little bit on financial literacy, although I'm going to get there by an indirect route. And I have this one serious concern about the way we've built the gig economy that feels to me like a fairly fundamental design error. That we've set up so many of the platforms in a way that try to go for the maximum number of buyers and sellers, and then to clear everything on the basis of either price or if it's a ride-sharing system, geography, and to clear it fast. And the result is we tend to drive down the price, and we tend to make it very difficult for people to personalize requests and to pay up for extra value add. And we clear at the lowest price, and that creates all sorts of problems in terms of livability. Let me give you two personal examples that happened to me within the past week that I think will show the contrast between when it can work right and when it works badly. So I now have this new book out. We're selling overseas rights, and they usually sell for a couple $1,000s, which is nice money, but not transformative. And we get this offer from China, or this approach saying we'd be interested in doing it. And I tell my agent, what if I wrote a special preface for them that made this relevant to China and talked about how these themes play to the global expansion? And they come back and they make an offer for $16,000, which is going to be by far my best one. I'm going, this is really nice. We took a sort of a gig pairing and we turned it into something better for both sides, and I'm going to get nicely paid for this. The day after this, I open up my email inbox and I get a note from someone who knows me through Mechanical Turk, because I've signed up for Mechanical Turk because I do this kind of stuff just to see the gig economy at all its levels. This is the Amazon system of small jobs contracted out. They have a study they want me to participate in, and if I do it, they will give me a bonus of 60 cents. And yes, 0.60. We're talking about a factor of multi-thousands of difference in pay. I cannot make a living doing Mechanical Turk projects. I could sit there and click buttons 24 hours a day, and I would still not be able to pay my rent or my groceries. And my worry is that a lot of our biggest platforms are built to be like Mechanical Turk. And that's ultimately unfair to workers. And to some extent, it's unfair to employers too, because the opportunity to create really high value work is diminished or shut down. We never even open the door. So I'd like to see a way that we can build platforms that become little islands of specialized, high skill, customized work. And I think that will let people get rewarded for the skills they have. And it will mean that what we get out of the gig economy will also be much more constructive and valuable in terms of helping grow businesses and grow jobs.
Great points. Thank you. And really bang on examples as well. I have a funny feeling, I bet all of us have had our own versions of that sense of, on the one hand, sometimes wanting to pay more or being happy, willing to pay more. And at the same time, really craving a more curated experience, whatever the cost, whether it's affordable or expensive, but having that as an option. And I want to come back to this theme of the gig economy more as we start to wind down this conversation. But first, I know, Sarah, you wanted to say a couple things.
I wanted to follow up George's point, because the nature of the gig economy and in particular, what it means for a young person to build an economic identity and a sustainable livelihood versus just making money, ends meet day to day. Really, I think that kind of what Nico was getting at, the difference between surviving and actually thriving. That has been such a big focus for us this year, and I think a real point of concern. There's no denying, as I said, that this is where youth are, and that the informal economy, I think, is here. It's going to be here for a long time, and it's going to potentially grow. But one of the really interesting examples that we had at the summit this year was a group based in Nairobi, Kenya, that is kind of embracing the reality of the informal economy and trying to create digital or economic identity for gig workers in this space. And in Kenya, or in Nairobi rather, 80% of the economy and 1/3 of the GDP is represented by the informal economy, just to give you kind of sense of the scale of this. So this company called Link is using web, mobile, and SMS platforms to try and create an economic identity for informal workers where they've never had one before. And part of the objective is to make it easier for gig workers to connect with potential clients by displaying their work history and skills. So capturing a sense of, this is what I've done, these are the skills that I have, but then even going deeper and saying, here's how I specialize. I'm a carpenter, I'm a plumber, I know how to fix, X, Y, and Z. It also generates client reviews and helps kind of build that sense of efficiency. And I think the underlying goal is to really help strengthen incentives for workers and clients to engage in fair and professional transactions, because another concern, of course, is in the gig economy, in the informal economy, I think particularly young people and young women working in the informal economy are vulnerable, and there are a lot of risks involved. And so how do you create greater trust and accountability between gig workers and between clients? And if you can engage this idea of trust and kind of visibility around skills, could we actually help contribute to improving the conditions within the gig economy such that we don't see, this sort of rush towards suppressed wages, and actually start to see young people being able to navigate and grow within that space? So, again, I think there's some interesting examples of platforms that are trying to do this, that tap into all of the things we've talked about, digital identity, certification, skill building, and creating really, pathways as opposed to kind of survival, that are really exciting. And I think we'll see that, I hope to see that in the US as well, as more people get pushed into kind of micro entrepreneurship and gig work.
Mm-hmm. Tina, this feels to me, and I know we're gonna start winding down briefly here, but Tina, this feels to me like it's also very much in the bullseye of the kinds of services that you provide, your perspective in this space. Do you have any tips, suggestions, favorites for approaches that you've seen work particularly well, or again, things you wish existed but don't yet, sorry.
It's so interesting hearing everyone's perspective. What we realized is no one knows anything about money. I mean, regardless of like where you stand or your socioeconomic background, a lot of people are just generally really clueless about anything related to money and investing and saving and budgeting. What the other thing that's interesting is we do find that women are at much more of a disadvantage, especially because the conversations don't exist. They don't necessarily have the guidance. They don't have access to the same, whether it's parents or peers that are also kind of encouraging them or enabling them to take advantage of investing opportunities or planning for retirement. What we see is there are a lot of amazing resources online, and there are more and more coming up. I mean, Khan Academy is one of the best just because it's really simple and visual. We're actually now creating content for banks and financial institutions. And what we're finding is that a lot of the problems that people face with their financial kind of well-being is that they start their careers with a lot of debt, student loan debt, or graduating with really kind of fewer choices in life because of this huge burden of paying back their loans that last their entire lifetime. And so what we're trying to do is help people understand kind of more about, even before they reach the age of kind of making those decisions, understand what the impact of those decisions are to have student debt, loans, credit cards, for example. Part of what the problem has been also, and banks and financial institutions, insurance companies are all realizing this, is that there hasn't been a lot of very transparent, objective information for people who do want to find or learn more about finance and to educate themselves. And so we're trying to do that. We're doing that. There are a lot of other amazing resources and courses online. But again, I think the challenge is really finding people at the right time before they have to make the difficult decisions and before it's too late. And, I think to Nico's point early on, the opportunity to kind of educate people and show them that even saving or investing a little bit of money has a tremendous impact down the line, how compounding works, how, just starting early can have, make all the difference in both your career and your personal life. So, we feel like there are a lot of great opportunities out there. Again, for people to find them and actually have access to them is the other challenge that we're trying to solve in creative ways.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Thank you. And it's kind of interesting as I reflect back just even on this conversation where I said, at the outset, we're going to focus on younger workers, those that are perhaps just before they've entered the workforce or millennials, that sort of thing. But in fact, at the end, I think we haven't actually gone young enough that really about preparing for not just lifelong learning, but so much of what we need to be putting in place goes far before you're actually with a job, handling a salary, or earning income in some way. I'm also really struck, and I think this is George and Sarah and everyone has referred to it in some way, but particularly in my role as an advisor to startups and to governments and so forth around the world on this future of work, gig economy, freelance economy, and new business models more broadly that enable people to earn income in new ways, is that depending on where I am, and again, I was in South Africa last month, for example, and I was in Kenya a few months ago, but then I'm also in places like Canada and Denmark and, other end of the spectrum in terms of a robustness of social safety nets and infrastructure for the labor force. But when I'm in South Africa, everyone's quite excited that they see the gig economy may actually help formalize the informal economy. For the first time, bringing this 80% online gives us some sense of who they are, gives us some sense of, one's ability to earn an income and that sort of thing. And then at the other end of the spectrum, take a place like Denmark, where they say, no, the gig economy is actually informalizing what was a formal work economy that, in fairness, even beyond technology, has been starting to fray for some time. But now basically you're shredding it all apart. So it's interesting because I look at the gig economy at the end of the day, I guess from my perspective, it's a little bit of both. It certainly has the potential to do both, to both formalize the informal and informalize what used to be more formal. Where the balance lies at the end of the day, I guess that's part of why we're here today. And that's what we're going to be figuring out in the months and years to come. But I do think we do need to wrap up at this point. Not quite yet. What I'd love to do is just a very brief round robin, in which each of you has an opportunity to share any thoughts that you might not have had a chance to yet, and or just share any sentiments you have reflecting on this conversation and new perspectives or new insights that might have emerged as a result. So I won't point at anyone. Does anyone want to go first? I'll go ahead and just offer this up. Or maybe I will call on somebody. Just kidding.
I can start. This is Nico. I think my reflection here is, so first of all, so many great things were said. And then every time I leave a wonderful conversation like this, I always feel I wish we could find a way to bring all of this together in a more coherent way so that we can move the needle collectively versus in many different ways alone. And I understand that this is a field where, I come from the private sector. I've also represented the nonprofit sector. I've been with government, and everyone has its own role in this space. But I think collectively we could just be so much stronger, and just finding a way to continue this knowledge sharing and understanding how we can all come into this and provide our piece of the puzzle to create and scale a bigger impact is a massive question. But it's something that I would love to figure out a way to do.
Thank you. I'll wrap up everybody and then we'll close. But thank you, Nico. Sarah.
I guess kind of three things. First, I think that the future of work, the gig economy, the sharing economy, transferable skills, whatever you want to call it, I think it means different things for different people, to your point, April. And a lot of that depends on where you're starting from and the kinds of skills you come into it with, and the nature of your economy. And the more, and that's okay. And I think that the more we can understand the nuance of different country contexts and how to respond in terms of programs and institutions and policy, the better off we'll be. That said, I think that there's some very exciting ways to link best practices and evidence together that are both from the US side and the international side. And in our case, I think the US models or domestic interventions have sometimes served as a kind of forecast for where we'll be in international development, providing really interesting basis of research and evidence or program models that have been adapted overseas. And vice versa, when we talk about the future of work, I think there are cases where developing economies have leapfrogged the US in terms of innovation and being able to respond to some of these challenges. And we could learn a lot from that too. And then finally, to Nico's point, I agree. I think that sometimes it's sort of, you leave these conversations feeling a bit deflated because there's so much, and where do we start? And there's all these issues, and how do we knit them together? And that's one of the purposes of our network at Making Sense, is we're really trying to connect the dots across the youth livelihood pathway of where are the intervention points, how do we support youth to have kind of long-term livelihoods that are sustainable, meaningful, and fulfilling. And so we'll be continuing to explore this topic, the future of work, in the network and at the summit in September in DC. But I agree, I think we need to find a way to link these conversations together, and there's a lot to be gained from doing that by connecting the threads between US and international perspectives.
Wonderful. And real quick, one thing I would add is that all of us, if we have links, this is one of the really interesting things about the reInvent series and the website. Any links, even just as starting places, we can share, and those will be posted. So if you're here or if you're watching, those will be posted on the website, and that will be a live, ongoing source of information and resources. So please feel free to share. Thank you, Sarah. Tina.
Hi. So I just, to echo what everyone else has said, and what I find interesting is that things change very quickly. People, they say that, we're going to be in driverless cars in the next couple of years, and there will be no more Uber drivers. So it'll be interesting to see how quickly all of that progresses, and how, the gig economy shifts, but also just people kind of where the workforce is headed in the next few years. And I always think about kind of, someone was mentioning how, like, in Star Trek, there's no money exchanged. Maybe there will be a world in the future where, we won't need people to work as much, and there'll be other opportunities to spend our time doing more useful things. So.
Agreed. Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, I think from coming at it from a training perspective, and I think one of the challenges, obviously, in conversations like this, that are engaging a multiplicity of tightly intertwined and very complex issues, there isn't a sort of a one-size-fits-all solution that I think we can sort of lean on to sort of address, these different skill gaps. And I think, what's exciting about discussions like this one is that a lot of different organizations are, addressing the complexity of these problems from specific areas of expertise, and hopefully that there's a sort of a collective shift that can occur as a result of that collaboration. But, I think sometimes there can be an impulse to sort of flock to one sort of particular solution as the sort of the thing that will solve all of our problems. And I think that's, not a realistic expectation. At the same time, I do think that, I see the sort of different organizations and programs that I feel fortunate enough to partner with, and, all the organizations that are and viewpoints that are represented on this call, give me a lot of optimism about sort of what the future holds. So I think ultimately it really comes down to how can, we as a whole ecosystem, efficiently coordinate while also having a level of independence to sort of tackle these problems in our own way and make the highest best use of our resources to address some of these challenges.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. And George, bring us home.
There we go. Great. So I really appreciated the global dimension of this as well. That I think it's doubly valuable and there's a mindset in some circles that a job created in another country is a job stolen from our country. And this was really refreshing to get a sense that the global economy grows together and weaves together in useful ways. So I hope we can continue that level of messaging. I'm reminded of being at tech events a few years ago and being told that Africa was leapfrogging the rest of the world in phone communications and just never bothered to put in the landlines that sustained the US and Europe for much of the 20th century and just went straight to mobile. And thinking, well, that's an interesting argument. I don't know if I buy it or not, but it's an interesting thing to say. And now you look at how mobile we've become, and there is that sense that progress does not necessarily start in the OECD countries and flow to emerging economies. Sometimes it goes the other way. So I think this is rich territory. I hope we can reconvene for a second round in 2018. And I really look forward to hearing the exchange of ideas.
Thank you so much, George, and thank you all. And I think I will keep my closing comments very, very brief. Most of all, just a round again of thanks and gratitude for joining today, diving into hard skills, soft skills, supporting skills, talking about young workers and then even younger cohorts, and lifelong learning, renewable learning, the whole bit. No shortage of things to go from here. It certainly no shortage of things to dive into from here. It certainly has been inspiring and eye-opening for me also in my own work. So just a warm round of thanks. Again, reInvent will be posting this online, editing it some, and this will be an ongoing resource where we can continue to come back to it to add resources as well as perhaps continue the conversation. So with that, thank you, and I think we will close with happy holidays and onwards from here.